Well, now let's take a closer look at the meeting in Ottawa, as well as other issues surrounding the WTO. I'm joined by Robert Moran, a partner with the Brunswick Group right here in Washington. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
So a lot of people are wondering, obviously you have this backdrop of the US-China trade war. Why hold this meeting now?
Well, I think the theory behind this meeting is that a number of powers and trading partners that are not the two big dogs in this fight are trying to work out some middle ground or some new reform package that could then slowly work its way through the system and become something that the US and China could embrace.
Now, a lot of people are wondering, what's the thinking then? Obviously, you have these two very influential, the two biggest economies being left out of this first stage. What are the pros and cons that come with that?
Well, from everything I've heard, that the United States didn't want to be in the room when this was happening. I think the pros are that you don't have a lot of rhetoric back and forth between the US and China in the room. I think there's obvious cons that the two main world economies are not present at the time. But I think everyone's pretty clear that the first step here is simply trying to address some of the issues that the Trump administration has raised, and the Trump administration is playing hardball with the WTO.
And so what do we know about the response from the US and China? You mentioned that they didn't want to be involved. In terms of what's being discussed and their obligations under the WTO?
It's tough. So essentially what's happened is the Trump administration has been pushing on the WTO and has blocked nomination of judges. And what that has done is it has set a timetable for December 2019 in which the WTO essentially will not be able to adjudicate any cases because those judges will lapse and it will take it below the number of judges needed, which is 3 to adjudicate cases. So what they're doing is they're using what we would think of in the business world as negotiating leverage to push this issue. Now, what's interesting here is some of the things that are being brought up are how the WTO deals with state-owned enterprises, how the WTO deals with subsidies, how the WTO deals with forced technology transfer, and very importantly, how the WTO designates a developing nation, which gives about 140 benefits to it. So those things are essentially being discussed in all kinds of apparently different working groups of the 13 nations.
And certainly that label very important, considering China is still considered, at least under the WTO, as a developing nation.
That's right. And I think that's one of the big sticking points with this administration. It feels that China is getting somewhat of a free ride, essentially, with that designation, and wants it walked back. And by the way, it's interesting, a number of U.S. trading partners have raised some of these concerns in the past. It's just that the Trump administration is pushing so much more and using it as more of a political issue domestically.
Now, outside of the US-China issues, we know that a lot of other countries obviously have their own set of issues that they wanted to bring to the table. What are some of the reforms and the challenges that the WTO is trying to address?
Well, the problem is, I think, time. The WTO was created in a slightly different era, and now we have a number of product categories that we really didn't think a lot about. I mean, when you think about when China entered the WTO, the idea of digital products and services was still in its relative infancy, and that is one very big issue. There are all sorts of other issues here, too. A number of the larger trading partners are agricultural superpowers, and there are always discussions around sort of how governments subsidize or do not subsidize or protect various agricultural industries. So I think that's another one. But I mean, generally speaking, a lot of this has to do with the passage of time and needing to update some of this. And I think it's fair to argue that some of the WTO's machinery should probably be updated. I think a number of people would probably agree with that.
Now, some people, including President Trump, have criticized the WTO as being essentially irrelevant or really not serving a purpose. So when you have countries acting unilaterally, does the WTO risk becoming obsolete?
Well, that's a great point. I think that this meeting in Ottawa right now is about their relevancy to some extent. Now, I do think the WTO is critically important, too, because it sets the rules and then the ability for people to try cases essentially on trade. And without that, you end up getting into a world of all these sort of bilateral or other trade pacts. And I think the world trading system could start to break down without the WTO. I mean, the interesting thing here is the Trump administration has criticized it. This was an institution the United States essentially backed and wanted to be built because it was in the U.S.'s best interest as the #1 economy. But the Trump administration has a different view and is sort of trying to walk some of these things back. I think it's good domestic politics for him, and I think that's part of why they're doing this.
Right.
You know, we know Gallup research shows this summer, 62% of Americans believe that China is an unfair trader. Now, they have much lower support for tariffs, but there is some political support there, and that's what the president is playing to. And it's good for him in the Electoral College, too.
Certainly, political perception, very important given
Yes.
these upcoming midterm elections. Thank you so much. Always good to have you. Rob Moran there from the Brunswick Group.